I stood near the edge of the stage, the heavy silk of my dark green evening gown brushing against the polished hardwood floor. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis was completely packed. 300 of the wealthiest, most influential people in the city were sitting at tables covered in white linen, drinking champagne from crystal flutes. It was the annual Mercer Hope Foundation Gala. For the last 6 months, this gala had been my entire life. I had personally designed the seating charts, carefully balancing the massive egos of local politicians and real estate developers. I had tasted every single option on the catering menu. I had handwritten 300 personalized thank you notes for the VIP gift bags. I had memorized the names of our top donors' children, their recent vacations, and their preferred vintage of wine. I did the work, but Victor got the applause. My husband of 27 years, Victor Mercer, stood in the direct center of the brightly lit stage. He looked incredibly handsome in his custom black tuxedo, holding the microphone with the practiced ease of a natural politician. He was the founder and CEO of Mercer Development Group. He loved the spotlight. He thrived on the adoration of a crowd. He had also been drinking heavily for the last 3 hours. The charity auction was supposed to be the highlight of the night. We were auctioning off luxury vacations, courtside tickets, and private dinners with celebrities. Victor was playing the role of the charming auctioneer, working the crowd, making them laugh, smoothly extracting thousands of dollars from their deep pockets. I was standing off to the side, signaling the catering staff to begin pouring the coffee, when Victor suddenly turned and pointed directly at me. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," Victor announced, his voice echoing loudly through the massive sound system, "for our final, highly exclusive item of the evening." He walked over to the edge of the stage, grabbed my hand, and forcefully pulled me up into the harsh, blinding glare of the spotlight. I stumbled slightly in my heels, but quickly regained my balance, forcing a polite, highly practiced smile onto my face. I assumed he was going to publicly thank me for organizing the event. It was a standard part of his routine. The charming husband acknowledging his supportive wife. But Victor didn't thank me. He leaned close to the microphone, an arrogant, deeply mocking smirk spreading across his face. "I've been married to this woman for 27 years, Victor said to the crowd, his words slightly slurred from the expensive scotch. "She doesn't play golf. She doesn't know the first thing about commercial real estate. And it takes her 3 hours to get ready for dinner." He paused for dramatic effect. "So," Victor announced loudly, laughing at his own joke, "let's start the bidding at $20. Who wants this useless wife?" The silence that followed lasted for a fraction of a second, before the entire ballroom erupted. 300 people laughed. They weren't chuckling politely. They were roaring with genuine amusement. The politicians I had placed at the best tables were laughing. The real estate developers, whose wives I had entertained at endless brunches, were laughing. The wealthy socialites, who had happily accepted my handwritten thank you notes, were laughing. They were all laughing at me. I stood completely still in the center of the stage, the blinding spotlight exposing every single detail of my face to the massive crowd. If this were a movie, I would have burst into tears and run off the stage. Or I would have slapped him across the face, grabbed the microphone, and delivered a blistering, highly dramatic speech defending my honor. But I am 54 years old. I have spent decades surviving in the deeply toxic, highly judgmental world of extreme wealth. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I didn't break. I simply stood there, my chin held high, maintaining a posture of absolute, unyielding dignity. I looked out at the sea of laughing faces, committing the moment to memory. I realized, with a cold, terrifying clarity, that this wasn't just a drunk joke. This was how Victor truly saw me. I was a prop. I was an accessory. And when the accessory was no longer amusing, it could be mocked for entertainment. "Come on, gentlemen," Victor yelled over the laughter, clearly thrilled with the massive reaction his cruel joke had generated. $20. That's a steal for someone who can organize a decent closet. Do I hear 25? The laughter grew louder. A man in the front row, Thomas Bell, Victor's primary business partner, jokingly held up his auction paddle. I'll give you 15, Victor, Thomas shouted, causing another wave of raucous laughter to roll through the room. Victor grinned, opening his mouth to deliver another punchline. $2 million. The voice didn't come from the front row. It didn't come from the VIP tables. It came from the very back of the massive ballroom, near the heavy oak doors. It wasn't a shout. It was a deep, incredibly calm, impossibly resonant voice that cut through the chaotic laughter like a scalpel. The laughter died instantly. 300 heads whipped around, desperately trying to find the source of the impossible bid. Standing at the back of the room was a man I had never seen before. He appeared to be in his early 60s, with silver hair and sharp, deeply intelligent eyes. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing a highly tailored, charcoal gray business suit that projected an aura of quiet, absolute authority. He didn't have a numbered auction paddle. He simply had his right hand raised calmly in the air. Victor squinted against the stage lights, trying to see who had interrupted his moment of glory. He assumed it was another joke. "I'm sorry, sir." Victor laughed nervously, the joke rapidly losing its momentum in the face of the dead silence. "I think you misunderstood. We were just having a little fun." "I didn't misunderstand anything, Mr. Mercer," the man replied, his voice echoing clearly across the silent ballroom. He lowered his hand and began walking slowly down the center aisle. The wealthy guests actively parted for him, stepping aside as if he carried a magnetic field. "You asked for a bid on the woman standing next to you," the man continued, his eyes locked entirely on me. He didn't even look at Victor. "I bid $2 million. He reached the front of the stage and stopped. Up close, the sheer gravity of his presence was overwhelming. He wasn't playing a game. He was entirely, terrifyingly serious. Victor's arrogant smirk finally collapsed. He realized, with a sudden, cold jolt of panic, exactly who he was talking to. "Mr. Rowe," Victor stammered, his voice dropping the auctioneer persona entirely, replacing it with the desperate, groveling tone he used with major investors. "Nathaniel Rowe, I didn't realize you were in attendance tonight. We are incredibly honored to have you here." A murmur of shocked recognition rippled through the room. Nathaniel Rowe was a ghost in the financial world. He ran a massive, highly secretive private equity firm out of New York. He was notoriously reclusive, completely ruthless in business, and worth billions. Victor had been trying to get a meeting with him for 3 years to secure funding for a new commercial development. And Victor had just publicly offered to sell him his wife for $20. "I am not here for your foundation, Mr. Mercer," Nathaniel Rowe said coldly, his voice completely devoid of the polite social warmth Victor was desperately trying to project. "I am here for her." Nathaniel looked up at me. His expression wasn't mocking. It wasn't pitying. It was an expression of profound, absolute respect. "Mrs. Mercer," Nathaniel said softly, addressing me directly for the first time. "It is an absolute honor to finally meet you." I stared down at him, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, completely bewildered. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rowe," I replied, my voice remarkably steady despite the chaotic surrealism of the moment. "Do we know each other?" "We do not," Nathaniel answered gently. "But you knew someone very important to me, and I have been looking for you for a very long time." Victor stepped forward, desperately trying to regain control of the narrative, completely terrified that his highly public, cruel joke had just offended the most powerful man in the room. "Mr. Rowe," Victor laughed nervously, trying to put his hand on my shoulder. I smoothly stepped away from his touch. "If this is about a donation, we can certainly discuss it in my office tomorrow morning. The Mercer Hope Foundation would be thrilled to partner with." "I don't partner with men who use their wives as punchlines to entertain a room full of sycophants," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly cold, lethal register. He finally looked at Victor, and the absolute disdain in his eyes was palpable. "The bid was $2 million. If you can't honor the auction, Mr. Mercer, I suggest you put the microphone down." Nathaniel turned his attention back to me, his expression softening instantly. "Mrs. Mercer," Nathaniel asked politely, "would you do me the profound honor of having dinner with me tomorrow evening? There is a story I need to tell you, a story that does not belong in this room." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. 300 of the city's elite were holding their collective breath, watching the invisible, useless wife being addressed with the kind of reverence usually reserved for royalty. I looked at Victor. He looked terrified, furious, and entirely powerless. I looked back at Nathaniel Rowe. "I would love to have dinner with you, Mr. Rowe," I said clearly. "Excellent," Nathaniel smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "My driver will pick you up at 7. He didn't say another word to Victor. He didn't acknowledge the crowd. He simply turned around and walked out of the ballroom, leaving the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind him. The ride home that night was the quietest, most suffocating car ride of my entire 27-year marriage. Victor sat in the back of the town car, staring out the window into the darkness, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth would crack. The alcohol had worn off, leaving him entirely consumed by a paranoid, defensive panic. He had intended to humiliate me. Instead, he had humiliated himself in front of the exact man he desperately needed money from. And he had absolutely no idea how it had happened. "How do you know him?" Victor suddenly demanded, turning to glare at me, his voice harsh and accusatory. "I don't know him, Victor," I replied calmly, staring straight ahead at the partition. "I told you that on the stage." "Don't lie to me, Adeline," Victor snapped, his paranoia escalating rapidly. "Nathaniel Rowe doesn't just show up at a charity gala unannounced and offer $2 million for a woman he's never met. He said you knew someone important to him." "Who? Are you having an affair? Is this some sick game to embarrass me?" I finally turned my head and looked at my husband. He had just stood on a stage and offered to sell me for $20 in front of 300 people. And now, he was accusing me of embarrassing him. The absolute death-taking narcissism was almost fascinating to witness. "You embarrassed yourself, Victor," I said quietly, my voice devoid of any anger or emotion. "You told a joke. It just didn't land the way you thought it would." Victor didn't say another word to me for the rest of the night. When we got home, he went straight into his home office and slammed the door. I walked upstairs, unzipped my heavy green gown, and carefully hung it in the closet. Downstairs, I could hear Victor's muffled voice yelling through the door of his office. He was on the phone with his executive assistant, Celia Grant. "I don't care what time it is, Celia," Victor shouted, panic bleeding into his tone. "Call Elliot Graves. Wake him up if you have to. I want a full, comprehensive background check on Nathaniel Rowe, and I want a completely deep dive into Adeline's history. Phone records, emails, bank accounts, everything. I want to know exactly what connection she has to Rowe before she gets in a car with him tomorrow night." He was hiring a private investigator to dig into my life, desperately hoping to find a scandal he could use to leverage his way out of the disaster he had created. He wouldn't find a scandal, but he was about to find out exactly who he was married to. The following evening at exactly 7 p.m., a sleek, black Bentley pulled into my driveway. I didn't tell Victor I was leaving. I simply walked out the front door, wearing a simple, elegant navy dress, and got into the back seat. The driver took me to a small, incredibly private, fiercely exclusive Italian restaurant tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. Nathaniel Rowe was already sitting in a secluded booth in the back corner, completely hidden from the rest of the room. He stood up when I approached the table, waiting for me to sit before taking his own seat. It was a small gesture of respect that Victor had abandoned 2 decades ago. "Thank you for coming, Adeline," Nathaniel said warmly. "I hope the scene I caused last night didn't create too much trouble for you at home." "The trouble at home existed long before you walked into the ballroom, Mr. Rowe," I replied honestly, folding my napkin on my lap. "But I must admit, I am intensely curious. Why did you bid $2 million? Nathaniel smiled softly, signaling the waiter to pour the wine. "Because I watched your husband try to assign a price tag to your dignity," Nathaniel answered, his sharp eyes filled with absolute sincerity. "And I happen to know exactly what your dignity is worth. It is worth significantly more than $2 million. But that was the highest number I thought the room could process without fainting." I took a sip of the wine, letting the quiet warmth of the restaurant settle my nerves. "You said I knew someone important to you. I prompted gently. Nathaniel nodded, his expression turning deeply serious, carrying the heavy weight of a long-held grief. 30 years ago, Adeline, Nathaniel began, leaning forward slightly. You were a young elementary school teacher. You lived in a small apartment complex on the east side of the city. I nodded slowly, surprised by the specific detail. Yes, I taught third grade before I married Victor. Do you remember a rainy Tuesday afternoon in November? Nathaniel asked, his voice dropping to a quiet, intense whisper. You were waiting at the Greyhound bus station downtown. You were picking up a friend who was visiting for the holidays. I frowned, digging deep into the archives of my memory. 30 years was a very long time. I remembered the bus station. I remembered the rain. While you were waiting, Nathaniel continued, you noticed a young girl sitting on a bench near the lockers. She was 15 years old. She was soaking wet, shivering violently, and clutching a cheap duffel bag to her chest. She looked absolutely terrified. The memory hit me with the sudden, physical force of a lightning strike. I remembered her. I remembered the thin, ragged jacket she was wearing. I remembered the dark purple bruise on the left side of her jaw. I remembered the sheer, desperate panic in her wide eyes. I remember, I whispered, the image coming into sharp focus. The girl was running away, Nathaniel explained, his voice thick with emotion. Her mother had married a deeply abusive man. He was violent, and the situation had become incredibly dangerous. I was away at college, completely unaware of what was happening at home. She had stolen $40 from his wallet and bought a bus ticket. But she had nowhere to go. She was sitting in that station, freezing, hungry, and waiting for the police or her stepfather to find her. Nathaniel reached across the table. You didn't walk past her, Adeline, Nathaniel said softly. You didn't ignore her like the hundreds of other people in that station. You walked over, sat down next to her, and asked her one simple question. I closed my eyes, hearing my own voice echoing from 30 years ago. Would you like to sit with me for a while? You didn't interrogate her, Nathaniel continued, recounting the story as if it were a sacred text. You took her to the diner across the street. You bought her a hot meal. When you saw the bruise on her face, you didn't judge her. You quietly, calmly walked to the payphone and called a social worker you knew through your school. And then you sat with her in that diner booth until 2 o'clock in the morning, holding her hand, waiting until you were absolutely certain she was safe in the custody of Child Protective Services. Nathaniel paused, taking a slow, deep breath to steady himself. That 15-year-old girl, Nathaniel said, looking directly into my eyes, was my little sister. Her name was Mara Rowe. The name hung in the quiet air of the Italian restaurant, completely shifting the gravity of the room. Mara Rowe. I remember her name, I whispered, the memories flooding back with startling clarity. I remembered the social worker arriving. I remembered Mara turning back to look at me before she got into the car, her young face pale but finally safe. I asked the social worker to follow up with me, to let me know she was okay. But due to confidentiality, they couldn't tell me where she was placed. I always wondered what happened to her. Nathaniel smiled, a proud, deeply emotional light shining in his eyes. She went into a specialized foster home, Nathaniel said, leaning back in the plush leather booth. It was difficult at first, but she was incredibly resilient. She went to college, she went to law school. She became one of the most brilliant, fierce child advocacy lawyers in the country. And 10 years ago, she founded the Mara Rowe Foundation to provide direct, immediate housing and legal aid to children and women fleeing abusive situations. I let out a slow, deeply relieved breath. A genuine smile broke across my face. In the deeply superficial, status-obsessed world I had lived in with Victor for 27 years, this was the first piece of truly beautiful news I had heard in a very long time. I am so incredibly happy to hear that, I said, meaning every single word. She must have been an amazing woman. I would have loved to see her again. Nathaniel's smile faltered slightly. The grief in his eyes suddenly grew incredibly sharp, casting a heavy shadow across his face. She was an amazing woman, Nathaniel said softly. But unfortunately, you cannot see her again. Mara passed away 8 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. The air completely left my lungs. "Oh, Nathaniel," I whispered, reaching across the table without thinking and gently touching his hand. "I am so incredibly sorry. I had no idea." "Thank you." Nathaniel nodded, accepting the gesture of comfort. She fought it fiercely, right to the absolute end. But before she passed, she made me promise her two things. He pulled a thick, heavy, wax-sealed envelope from the inner pocket of his suit jacket and placed it carefully on the table between us. "The first promise," Nathaniel explained, his voice entirely steady, "was that I would find the woman who saved her life at the bus station 30 years ago, and I would personally thank her. It took me months of hiring private investigators to track down the exact social worker, access the old sealed files, and finally connect the young elementary school teacher to the wife of Victor Mercer." He gently pushed the envelope across the table toward me. "The second promise," Nathaniel continued, "was that I would deliver this letter to you, and that I would ensure her final wishes regarding the foundation were executed exactly as she intended." I stared at the heavy envelope. It felt incredibly significant, as if it held the weight of an entire life inside it. I carefully broke the wax seal and pulled out a handwritten letter. The handwriting was elegant but slightly shaky, clearly written by someone who was physically weak but mentally absolute. "Dear Adeline, you probably don't remember me. I was the terrified 15-year-old girl at the bus station. You bought me a grilled cheese sandwich, and you didn't leave my side until you knew I was safe. I am writing this from a hospital bed, knowing I don't have much time left. Looking back at my life, at the foundation I built, and the thousands of women and children we've helped, I realized something profound. None of it would exist without you. Kindness doesn't disappear, Adeline. It doesn't evaporate. It multiplies. It ripples outward in ways we can never fully see. I was drowning, and you threw me a lifeline. Everything I built after that moment was built on the foundation of your kindness. My brother, Nathaniel, will manage the financial architecture of the foundation after I am gone. But he is a ruthless finance man. He doesn't have the heart for the groundwork. The foundation needs someone who understands the quiet, invisible work of caring for people. It needs someone who doesn't walk past a terrified girl at a bus station. It needs you. I have legally instructed Nathaniel to offer you a permanent, highly compensated seat on the board of directors, with absolute executive authority over the direction of the foundation's charitable operations. Please take it. Please continue the work you started 30 years ago. Asterisk, thank you for the grilled cheese. Thank you for my life. Love. Mara, I read the letter twice, my vision blurring with tears. I hadn't cried when my husband humiliated me in front of 300 people. But I wept quietly in the Italian restaurant for a 15-year-old girl who had grown up to change the world, and who had reached back across 30 years to change mine. She didn't just leave you a board seat, Adeline, Nathaniel said softly, watching me read the letter. She left you the keys to the entire operation. It is a fully funded, multi-million-dollar charitable trust. You would have the power to direct funding, open new shelters, and build educational programs without asking anyone for permission. I looked up at Nathaniel, the sheer magnitude of the offer completely overwhelming the reality I had known for 27 years. "Mr. Rowe," I whispered, wiping the tears from my cheeks. "I organize galas. I write thank you notes. I'm not a CEO. I'm a wife." "You are not just a wife, Adeline," Nathaniel said fiercely, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. "You are the woman who built the foundation of my sister's survival. And last night, I watched your husband try to convince a room full of people that you were entirely useless. He put a price on you because he is too small, too incredibly arrogant to understand your actual worth." Nathaniel leaned forward, his eyes burning with a quiet, lethal intensity. "I bid $2 million last night," Nathaniel stated coldly, "not because it was a joke, but because I wanted every single arrogant person in that room to shut their mouths and realize they were laughing at a woman who was worth more than all of their shallow, pathetic lives combined." While I was sitting in the Italian restaurant discovering a completely new life, my husband was actively attempting to destroy it. Victor was sitting in his massive, dimly lit home office. Standing across the desk from him was Elliot Graves, a highly expensive, deeply cynical private investigator who specialized in corporate espionage and high-net-worth divorces. Victor had paid Graves an exorbitant emergency retainer to completely dismantle my life over the last 24 hours. "All right, Elliot," Victor demanded, pouring himself a massive glass of scotch, his paranoia completely unchecked. "What did you find? Phone records, hidden emails, hotel receipts? How long has Adeline been sleeping with Nathaniel Rowe? I want the leverage before the divorce lawyers get involved." Graves looked at Victor, a slightly confused, deeply unimpressed expression on his face. He opened a thick manila folder and dropped it onto the heavy mahogany desk. "She hasn't been sleeping with him, Victor," Graves stated bluntly, not bothering to sugarcoat the reality. "In fact, prior to last night, there is absolutely zero record of them ever communicating, meeting, or even existing in the same social circles. Your wife is entirely clean." Victor scowled, refusing to accept the answer. "That's impossible. A billionaire doesn't just offer $2 million for a woman he's never met." "Look deeper. Look at her bank accounts." "I did look at her bank accounts, Victor," Graves sighed, flipping the folder open to a stack of financial printouts. "And I found exactly what she's been doing behind your back for the last 20 years, while you were busy playing the big shot." Victor leaned forward, a triumphant, predatory smile finally appearing on his face. "I knew it. What did she buy?" "She didn't buy anything," Graves said, tapping the paper. "She gave it away." Victor frowned, completely confused. "Gave what away?" "Every single month, for the last 2 decades," Graves explained, reading directly from the financial traces. "Your wife has been quietly funneling her personal allowance into a series of highly targeted, completely anonymous charitable actions." Graves flipped the pages, listing the infractions, as if he were reading a criminal indictment. "She buys highly nutritious, expensive groceries for the elementary school she used to teach at, ensuring the lower-income students have breakfast," Graves stated. "She completely paid off the medical debt of the elderly widow who lives 3 streets over. She privately funds the legal retainers for 3 different veterans fighting the VA for their benefits. She has quietly sponsored the college tuition for 4 different teenagers aging out of the foster care system." Graves closed the folder and looked directly at Victor, who was staring at the desk in absolute paralyzed shock. "She isn't having an affair, Victor," Graves said coldly, gathering his things to leave. "She's just a profoundly good person. You hired me to find a scandal, to find her hidden dirt. But the only thing she was hiding from you was her absolute, undeniable humanity. Probably because she knew you wouldn't value it." Graves walked out of the office, leaving Victor entirely alone with the devastating truth. His wife wasn't a cheating, manipulative schemer. She was exactly what she appeared to be: a quiet, fiercely kind woman who had spent decades doing the actual charitable work he only pretended to care about on stage. But Victor didn't have time to process the emotional revelation, because the financial collapse of his empire had just officially begun. The next morning, at exactly 8 a.m., my phone buzzed with a news alert. Then it buzzed again, and again. I was sitting at the kitchen island, drinking coffee, watching the alerts pile up on the screen. The Mercer Hope Foundation Gala was a highly public event. The ballroom had been filled with socialites, influencers, and local politicians, all of whom had their cell phones out, recording the glamorous evening for their social media accounts. When Victor had pulled me onto the stage, dozens of cameras had been rolling. The video of the auction had leaked online overnight. It wasn't a flattering, heavily edited PR clip. It was raw, highly clear HD footage. It showed Victor, drunk and incredibly arrogant, gripping my arm, looking directly into the camera, and loudly offering to sell his useless wife for $20. It captured the cruel, roaring laughter of the elite crowd, and then it captured the absolute, devastating silence when Nathaniel Rowe's voice echoed through the room, bidding $2 million and publicly dressing Victor down. The video was a viral nuclear bomb. Within 4 hours, it had 3 million views across multiple platforms. The internet, which absolutely despises wealthy, arrogant men abusing their quiet wives, immediately weaponized the footage. The comments were brutal, entirely focused on destroying Victor's carefully crafted public image. Look at the way he holds her arm. He thinks he owns her. He runs a charity. He looks like a complete sociopath. The guy who bid $2 million is an absolute legend. He completely shut that arrogant clown down. Cancel Mercer Development. If he treats his wife like that in public, imagine how he treats his employees. Victor burst out of his home office, his phone glued to his ear, his face completely pale and slick with panicked sweat. He was wearing the same clothes he had worn the night before. He hadn't slept. No, Thomas, you cannot pull the funding. Victor screamed into the phone, pacing frantically across the living room. It was a joke. It was a poorly timed joke. You know me. I love my wife. He paused, listening to Thomas Bell, the same business partner who had laughingly bid $15 the night before, speak on the other end of the line. Thomas, please, Victor begged, the arrogance completely gone, replaced by pure financial terror. The city council is going to revoke the zoning permits if you pull out of the project. We stand to lose $30 million. Victor listened for another moment, his face draining of all remaining color, before the line went dead. He dropped the phone onto the sofa, completely defeated. He looked at me, sitting calmly at the kitchen island, drinking my coffee. They're pulling out, Victor whispered, his voice trembling. Thomas Bell, the Sterling Hotel Group, the international investors, they're all pulling their contracts. They said the video is a catastrophic PR nightmare. They said it shows a fundamental lack of character and leadership. He walked slowly toward the kitchen, his eyes pleading, desperately looking for the supportive, accommodating wife who had always fixed his messes. Adeline, Victor pleaded, reaching across the island, trying to grab my hand. You have to help me. The PR firm says the only way to kill the story is if we do a joint interview on the morning news. We sit together, we hold hands, and you tell the cameras that it was an inside joke. You tell them you thought it was funny. You tell them I am a wonderful, loving husband. I looked at his hand resting on the marble counter. Then I looked up into his panicked, deeply selfish eyes. Even now, standing in the absolute wreckage of his own arrogance, he didn't care about the humiliation he had caused me. He didn't apologize for making me a public joke. He only cared about using me as a human shield to protect his corporate contracts. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I set the mug down gently. No, Victor, I said, my voice completely calm, echoing with a quiet, unbreakable resolve. Victor stared at me, genuinely shocked. In 27 years, I had never flatly refused a request that protected his public image. Adeline, you don't understand, Victor said, his voice rising in panic. If you don't do this, the board of directors is going to force me out of my own company. They called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. They are going to strip me of my CEO title to save the brand. I will lose everything. You already lost everything. Victor, I replied softly, standing up from the stool. You just didn't notice because you were too busy listening to the applause. You have to lie for me, Victor shouted, his fear morphing into a desperate, pathetic anger. I am your husband. I gave you this life. You gave me a house, Victor, I corrected him, entirely unbothered by his anger. I built the life. I maintained the connections. I organized the foundation. And I am entirely done lying for you. I picked up my purse and walked toward the front door. Where are you going? Victor demanded, completely panicked by his total loss of control. We have to fix this. I am going to work, I said simply. What work? Victor scoffed, desperately trying to regain his position of dominance. You don't have a job, Adeline. I opened the front door, the bright morning sunlight washing over me. Actually, Victor, I do. I smiled, a genuine, powerful smile. I am the new executive director of the Mara Rowe Foundation, and I have a very busy schedule today. I left Victor completely speechless in the foyer and drove my car across the city to the primary operational headquarters of the Mara Rowe Foundation. It wasn't a glossy, massive glass skyscraper like the corporate headquarters of Mercer Development. It was a sturdy, unassuming brick building located in a working-class neighborhood. It was incredibly functional, entirely practical, and absolutely pulsing with purpose. Nathaniel Rowe was waiting for me in the lobby. He looked completely comfortable, in the bustling environment, though his expensive suit still stood out among the social workers and volunteers. "Good morning, Adeline," Nathaniel smiled, offering a respectful nod. "Welcome to the Foundation. Are you ready for the tour?" "I am," I replied, feeling a genuine, profound sense of excitement I hadn't experienced in over 2 decades. Nathaniel introduced me to Priya Nair, the director of shelter operations. She was a fierce, highly organized woman who had worked closely with Mara for 15 years. She didn't treat me like a wealthy socialite wife looking for a photo opportunity. She treated me like the new executive who needed to understand the mechanics of the operation. We currently operate 5 high-security emergency shelters across the state for women and children fleeing domestic violence, Priya explained, walking me through a bustling administrative wing. We also manage a fully funded legal clinic that handles emergency custody orders and restraining orders entirely pro bono. I listened intently, asking sharp, highly logistical questions about supply chains, funding allocations, and intake procedures. The organizational skills I had spent 27 years using to plan shallow, self-congratulatory galas were suddenly clicking into place, finding their true, highly effective purpose. "I'd like to show you the Family Intake Center," Priya said, leading me down a quiet hallway to a large, brightly lit room filled with comfortable chairs, toys, and small, private interview booths. Sitting in one of the chairs was a young woman. She looked to be in her late 20s, but exhaustion and fear had aged her significantly. She was holding a sleeping toddler against her chest, while a slightly older boy sat on the floor next to her, quietly drawing with crayons. She looked entirely defeated. She looked exactly like a slightly older version of the 15-year-old girl I had met at the bus station 30 years ago. "That's Leah Brooks," Priya whispered softly, noticing my attention. "She arrived at 3 o'clock this morning. She finally left an incredibly abusive husband. She slept in her car for 3 days before a police officer gave her our address. She has absolutely nothing. Her husband drained their bank accounts and canceled her credit cards. We have her in a temporary room, but we're struggling to find long-term, secure housing that will accept her without a credit history." I looked at Leah. I didn't see a charity case. I saw a woman who was drowning, desperately needing someone to throw a lifeline. "Priya," I said quietly, "if the foundation guarantees the lease, pays the security deposit, and covers the first 6 months of rent in advance, can we secure an apartment for her by the end of the week?" Priya blinked, slightly surprised by the immediate, highly aggressive financial solution. "Yes. If the foundation acts as the absolute guarantor, the landlords will approve the application immediately. But that requires executive board approval for emergency discretionary funds." "I am the executive board," I stated softly, a quiet, absolute authority settling into my voice. "Make it happen. Find her a safe apartment in a good school district." I walked across the room and sat down in the empty chair next to Leah. I didn't introduce myself as the new director. I didn't ask her invasive, traumatizing questions about her husband. I didn't play the role of the wealthy savior. I looked at the little boy coloring on the floor. "That's a beautiful drawing," I said gently. "Is that a dinosaur?" Leah looked up at me, her eyes wide, exhausted, and incredibly defensive. But my voice was calm, entirely non-threatening, and completely devoid of judgment. "It's a T-Rex," Leah whispered, holding her sleeping toddler tighter. "My name is Adeline," I said, offering a soft, completely genuine smile. "Would you like to sit with me for a while?" Leah stared at me, the defensive walls slowly cracking. She didn't need a lawyer right then. She didn't need a lecture on independence. She just needed another human being to sit with her in the absolute wreckage of her life and promise her that she wasn't entirely alone. Tears welled in Leah's eyes, and she nodded slowly. I sat with her for 2 hours. I listened. I bought lunch for the children. And before I left, I quietly told her that she didn't have to sleep in her car ever again. When I walked out of the intake center, Nathaniel was waiting in the hallway. He had watched the entire interaction through the glass window. "Mara was absolutely right about you, Adeline," Nathaniel said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't just write checks, you actually see them. I see them because I was looking. I replied, picking up my purse. For 27 years, I stood behind a man who demanded that everyone look entirely at him. I'm done looking at him, Nathaniel. I want to look at the work. Over the next 4 weeks, my life completely and fundamentally transformed. I practically lived at the foundation headquarters. I used my extensive, highly detailed knowledge of the city's elite, the exact people Victor had mocked me in front of, to aggressively restructure the foundation's fundraising strategy. I didn't ask them for polite donations. I leveraged their guilt over the viral video, demanding massive, highly publicized corporate sponsorships for the domestic violence shelters. And they paid. They paid millions, desperate to distance themselves from Victor Mercer's toxic brand and align themselves with the highly respected, unbothered woman he had publicly humiliated. Victor, meanwhile, was experiencing the absolute, catastrophic collapse of his entire reality. He had officially been forced to step down as CEO of Mercer Development Group. The board of directors, terrified of the massive PR fallout and the loss of major contracts, had aggressively ousted him, replacing him with Thomas Bell. Victor was essentially under house arrest in his own mansion, completely toxic, completely unemployable, and entirely alone. He watched me leave the house early every morning, dressed in sharp, powerful business suits, completely energized and entirely focused. He watched me return late in the evenings, exhausted, but deeply satisfied. He realized, with a slow, agonizing clarity, that I didn't need him. I didn't need his money. I didn't need his approval. I didn't need to stand in his shadow to feel important. I was running a multi-million-dollar empire of absolute kindness, and he was sitting alone in a dark office, completely destroyed by his own arrogance. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen island, reviewing architectural blueprints for a new, highly secure shelter facility we were building on the west side of the city. Victor walked into the kitchen. He looked completely defeated. He had lost weight, and the arrogant, charismatic politician persona was entirely gone. "Adeline?" Victor said quietly, standing awkwardly near the refrigerator. I didn't look up from the blueprints. "Yes, Victor? I received the divorce papers today," Victor whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "I know," I replied smoothly, making a note on the margin of the blueprint. "My lawyer confirmed delivery at 2 o'clock. You're really doing this?" Victor asked, a desperate, pathetic pleading in his tone. "After 27 years? You're just walking away?" I finally looked up. "I didn't walk away, Victor," I stated coldly. "You pushed me off the stage. I simply decided not to climb back up." "I was drunk, Adeline," Victor pleaded, tears welling in his eyes. He was finally, truly begging, not for his company, but for his marriage. It was a stupid, horrible, arrogant joke. "I am so incredibly sorry. I didn't realize who you actually were until you left. Please, don't do this." I looked at the man I had spent 3 decades loving, supporting, and desperately trying to please. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a profound, absolute indifference. "You didn't realize who I was because you never bothered to ask, Victor," I said quietly. "You only valued me when I was making you look good. You only noticed my worth when a billionaire pointed it out to you, and when the internet completely destroyed your life because of it." I rolled up the blueprints and slid them into my leather portfolio. "You didn't value me, Victor," I concluded with absolute finality. "You valued your audience, and now you don't have one." I walked out of the kitchen, leaving him entirely alone in the massive, incredibly empty house. 3 months later, I received an official invitation. It was a thick, heavily embossed envelope, exactly like the ones I used to spend hours designing for Victor's charity events. But this one wasn't inviting me to organize the catering. It was inviting me to be the exclusive keynote speaker at the annual Mara Rowe Foundation National Gala in New York City. The event was massive. It was being held at the Plaza Hotel, with over 500 guests, including national politicians, massive corporate sponsors, and highly influential philanthropists. I didn't hire a stylist. I didn't ask a husband how I looked. I wore a stunning, highly sophisticated, emerald green evening gown. I wore my hair up. I wore absolute unyielding confidence like a suit of armor. Nathaniel Rowe met me at the entrance to the grand ballroom. He smiled, offering his arm. "Are you ready, Adeline?" Nathaniel asked proudly. "I've been ready for 30 years, Nathaniel," I replied. We walked into the ballroom together. As we entered, a quiet, respectful hush fell over the massive crowd. They weren't looking at Nathaniel, the billionaire private equity ghost. They were looking at me. They were looking at the woman who had taken a viral moment of profound humiliation and transformed it into a massive, highly effective empire of charitable action. I walked directly to the stage. I didn't need a husband to pull me up. I walked up the stairs under my own power, stepped directly into the center spotlight, and adjusted the microphone. I looked out at the sea of 500 faces. I saw Priya Nair sitting at the front table, smiling proudly. I saw Leah Brooks, who we had flown in for the event, sitting next to her, looking healthy, safe, and incredibly strong. And in the very back of the room, standing near the heavy oak doors, completely hidden in the shadows, I saw Victor. He had flown to New York. He had used his last remaining connections to secure a standing room only ticket. He was standing in the dark, watching the woman he had called useless command the absolute, undivided respect of the most powerful room in the country. I didn't look away from him. I didn't flinch. I held his gaze for a long, heavy second, letting him see exactly what he had lost. Then I turned my attention to the crowd. "Thank you," I began, my voice clear, strong, and echoing with absolute purpose. 27 years ago, I believed that my role was to stand quietly in the background. I believed that true power belonged to the people holding the microphone. I smiled softly, shaking my head. "I was wrong," I continued. "True power does not exist in the spotlight. True power exists in a diner booth at 2 o'clock in the morning. True power exists when you look at a terrified, broken person and you do not walk away. True power is the absolute, unyielding choice to be kind in a world that constantly, desperately rewards cruelty." The ballroom was completely, absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. 30 years ago, I bought a grilled cheese sandwich for a 15-year-old girl named Mara, I said, the emotion finally bleeding into my voice. I didn't do it because I wanted recognition. I didn't do it to build a foundation. I did it because she was cold, and she was hungry, and she needed someone to sit with her. The massive digital screens behind me illuminated, projecting a montage of the people the foundation had helped over the last year. The faces of women who had escaped violence. The faces of children who had found safe foster homes. The faces of veterans who had finally received their benefits. Mara believed that kindness multiplies, I concluded, my voice rising, filling the massive room with absolute, undeniable authority. And she was right. Kindness doesn't disappear. It keeps the receipt. It waits. And when you need it most, it comes back and pays the debt. I looked directly into the camera, broadcasting the event live. "My name is Eloise Mercer," I announced proudly, "and I am incredibly honored to serve this foundation." The entire ballroom erupted. It wasn't the cruel, mocking laughter I had experienced a year ago. It was a massive, thunderous, highly emotional standing ovation. 500 people were on their feet, applauding fiercely, honoring the invisible work I had done for 3 decades. In the back of the room, Victor Mercer slowly turned around and walked out the door, entirely alone, completely forgotten by the world he had desperately tried to impress. The gala was a massive, unprecedented success. We secured over $15 million in operational funding in a single night. After the final speeches and the endless rounds of polite conversation, I slipped out a side door into a quiet, dimly lit hallway near the coat check. I needed a moment of absolute silence to process the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the evening. I leaned against the cool marble wall, taking a slow, deep breath, finally allowing myself to feel the profound weight of everything that had happened over the last year. "You were incredible up there, Adeline." The voice came from the shadows near the heavy exit doors. I turned my head. Victor was standing there. He looked incredibly small. He wasn't wearing a custom tuxedo. He was wearing a simple, off-the-rack dark suit that hung slightly loose on his frame. He had lost his company, his reputation, and his entire social circle. He didn't walk toward me. He didn't try to grab my arm or dominate the space. He stayed entirely in the shadows, maintaining a respectful distance. "I didn't expect you to stay for the speech, Victor," I said quietly, my voice entirely neutral. "I had to hear it," Victor replied, his voice thick with a genuine, profound sorrow. "I had to hear what I spent 27 years entirely missing." He looked at me, tears finally spilling over his cheeks. It wasn't the manipulative, panicked crying of a man trying to save his business. It was the absolute, devastating grief of a man who finally realized the magnitude of his own catastrophic blindness. I stood next to a truly extraordinary, beautiful, fiercely powerful woman for almost 3 decades, Victor whispered, his voice cracking. "And I never actually looked at you. I was so incredibly busy trying to make everyone look at me. I never bothered to ask you what you wanted. I never bothered to see the work you were doing." He took a slow, deep breath, wiping his eyes. "I am so incredibly sorry, Adeline," Victor said. And for the first time in his entire life, the apology was completely, undeniably real. "I am sorry for the joke. I am sorry for the arrogance. But most of all, I am sorry that I missed the privilege of knowing the woman who gave that speech tonight." I looked at him. I saw the broken, entirely defeated man standing in the shadows. I felt the sharp, bitter sting of the last year finally, permanently begin to fade. "I forgive you, Victor," I said softly. Victor looked up, a tiny, desperate flicker of hope igniting in his eyes. He took a hesitant step forward. "Adeline, do you mean that?" "I do." I nodded, maintaining my position against the wall. "I forgive you for the joke. I forgive you for the arrogance. I forgive you for making me invisible for 27 years. I took a deep breath, entirely closing the emotional door between us. "But forgiveness doesn't mean I am going back," I stated with absolute, unyielding finality. "I forgive you so I don't have to carry the anger anymore. But my life is not with you, Victor. It hasn't been for a very long time. I wish you the best, truly. But I am moving forward alone." The tiny flicker of hope in Victor's eyes completely died. He understood. The bridge was entirely, permanently burned. "I understand," Victor whispered, bowing his head respectfully. "Goodbye, Adeline. Goodbye, Victor," I replied. He turned around, pushed open the heavy exit doors, and walked out into the cold New York night, disappearing entirely from my life. 6 months later, the Mara Rowe Foundation officially opened 3 new emergency housing facilities in the Midwest. We launched a massive, fully funded collegiate scholarship program exclusively for teenagers aging out of the foster care system. I didn't just sit in a boardroom. I was on the ground. I reviewed the blueprints. I interviewed the shelter directors. I met with the scholarship recipients. I built a life entirely, completely devoid of the suffocating, toxic arrogance that had defined my marriage. I had a purpose, and I didn't need a single ounce of permission from anyone to execute it. On a quiet, overcast Tuesday afternoon, I asked Nathaniel Rowe to drive me to a small, beautifully maintained private cemetery on the outskirts of the city. We walked silently along the manicured stone pathways until we reached a simple, elegant marble headstone resting under the shade of a massive oak tree. Mara Rowe, a fierce advocate, a beloved sister. A lifeline eye placed a small, vibrant bouquet of yellow lilies, her favorite flower, gently against the base of the headstone. Nathaniel stood next to me, his hands clasped behind his back, a peaceful, deeply resolved expression on his face. He had fulfilled his sister's final promise, and he had watched the foundation she built thrive under the exact leadership she had chosen. "She used to talk about that bus station all the time," Nathaniel said quietly, looking at the headstone. "She always said that if you hadn't sat down next to her, she wouldn't have survived the night. She believed you saved her life, Adeline." I looked at the marble stone, feeling the profound, incredible weight of the 30-year journey that had brought me to this exact moment. "She was wrong, Nathaniel," I whispered, reaching out to gently trace the engraved letters of her name. Nathaniel looked at me, slightly confused. "What do you mean?" I smiled, a few tears quietly escaping down my cheeks. "I didn't save her life," I said softly, feeling the absolute, undeniable truth of the statement settle into my bones. "She saved mine. It just took 30 years for the rescue to arrive." Nathaniel smiled warmly, placing a gentle, reassuring hand on my shoulder. We stood there in comfortable silence for a few more minutes, before slowly turning back toward the car. As we walked back down the long stone pathway toward the cemetery gates, I noticed a young woman sitting entirely alone on a wooden bench near the entrance. She looked to be in her early 20s. She was wearing a thin jacket that wasn't warm enough for the overcast weather. She was shivering slightly, her arms wrapped tightly around a faded, overstuffed duffel bag sitting on her lap. She was staring at the ground, her face pale and etched with an intense, terrifying exhaustion. She looked like she was completely out of options. She looked like she was entirely alone in the world. Nathaniel saw her too. He stopped walking and looked at me, a quiet, knowing smile touching his lips. He didn't rush me. He simply waited. I looked at the young woman. I felt the familiar, quiet pull in my chest. The instinct that Victor had called useless. The instinct that had built a multi-million-dollar empire of absolute kindness. I didn't keep walking. I didn't look away. I walked over to the wooden bench. I didn't ask her why she was there. I didn't interrogate her about the duffel bag or the thin jacket. I simply sat down on the bench, leaving a respectful, safe distance between us. The young woman looked up at me, her eyes wide, guarded, and incredibly fearful. I offered her a soft, entirely genuine, deeply patient smile. "Hello," I said gently. "Hi," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't push. I didn't demand her story. I just offered the only thing that actually matters when the world is entirely dark. "My name is Adeline," I said quietly. The echoes of a rainy afternoon 30 years ago, ringing perfectly in my memory. "Would you like to sit with me for a while? So tell me honestly in the comments below. If your incredibly arrogant husband got drunk at a massive charity gala and publicly tried to auction you off for $20 as a useless wife, right in front of the 300 people you spent your entire life serving, would you burst into tears, run off the stage, and let him completely destroy your dignity while the entire room laughed at you? Or would you stand perfectly still, hold your head high, and wait for the billionaire in the back of the room to bid $2 million? Not for a joke, but because 30 years ago, your quiet, forgotten kindness saved his sister's life and secured you the executive seat of a massive charitable empire. Let me know. I read every single one.